What is up, guys? Justin Mechanic, and welcome back to another video. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about buying cheap sandpaper online and whether you should be buying cheap sandpaper or spending a little bit extra money and getting the higher quality stuff. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start discussing about this topic. And honestly, guys, if you guys know anything about me, I am very cheap. I'm always on a budget, always trying to get the best deal possible, whether it be in paint materials, or just sandpaper or any other stuff. I always like to get a good deal. Now, recently, I've been buying a lot of sandpaper, such as these, online or at Harbor Freight. And I've taken notice over the years about cheap sandpaper, and there has been a lot of negatives with these cheap sandpapers. So I'm gonna go ahead and educate you guys a little bit about these cheap sandpapers that you guys could find on Amazon or Harbor Freight, and hopefully it prevents you guys from doing the same mistakes that I have done. All right, so one thing to notice about cheap sandpaper that you could purchase on Amazon, I'm not gonna say the name, but one thing that I am very familiar with is misprinted sandpaper. Yes, I said that correctly, misprinted sandpaper. Now check this out, guys. As you guys could see, this is 150 grit sandpaper, and right on the top corner, you have 800. Now, this is actually not that bad of an example, but it is, however, an example. Now, I have seen paper misprinted so bad that you couldn't tell half of what the paper actually was. It literally said 800 on one side and 400 on the other. You could not tell whether it was a 800 or 400 grit sandpaper. So this is a major drawback when buying cheap sandpaper. Okay, and also it clogs up very quickly. So it's something that you guys got to be aware of. And yeah, so that is one thing that I took note of. I also have purchased recently sandpaper from Harbor Freight just because I was on a budget. I wanted some cheap stuff, and it ended up kicking me in the butt buying cheap sandpaper. Now, this one in particular is from Harbor Freight, as you can see right here, and I would not recommend buying sandpaper from Harbor Freight. Harbor Freight actually has very bad sandpaper, at least for automotive use. I have not seen really good results with their sandpaper, and I'll tell you why. Well, first off and foremost, delamination of the grit on the sandpaper. What ends up happening is you'll go through this sandpaper very quickly. The little grainage or the sand will end up falling off, and basically the sandpaper just loses its friction and is not able to be abrasive enough for you to finish your project. You'll end up having to finish that sheet and grab another one, and then continue on, and then grab another one and another one. So although you are saving some money on the initial cost, over time it actually ends up costing you a little bit more money, and that's why I would not recommend Harbor Freight sandpaper. Also, another thing to consider if you guys are buying cheap sandpaper, I would not recommend cheap sandpaper for color sanding. This actually happened to me several years ago. I was doing kind of a high-end paint job on a Grand National. I was doing some bumper fillers for a customer, or basically a friend, and I wanted to get the best finish possible, so I ended up color sanding. Now, I did end up using a very cheap sandpaper, and like I said, since this paper does delaminate very easily and those grits fall, what ended up happening is, as I was color sanding, one of those little grainage or those little grits fell in between the sandpaper and the panel, and I ended up gouging the clear on that paint job, and to the point where I could not fix it because the gouge was that deep. Okay, and that was I believe that was like a 1000 grit sandpaper. It wasn't very, it was a super fine sandpaper at that, but regardless, those little grainages will fall off the paper, will end up scratching your paint job. And if you're trying to finish, you know, if you got something that is very particular, or a customer that's very particular or picky, and you end up gouging their paint job, they are not going to be happy. So please stay away from cheap sandpaper. Now, I do understand that sometimes buying cheap isn't always bad. It could save you some money, but in the instances of finishing, as far as like color sanding and stuff like that, I would not recommend it. I would suggest going with a little bit better of a brand. You are going to pay that that costs a little bit more, or the sandpaper is going to cost you a little bit more, but in the long run, it's a little bit better of quality, and it avoids having problems like delamination and misprinted paper. Like I said, that could be pretty detrimental. If you went to grab this and you saw that 800 and you thought it was a finishing pad, and then you find out it's a 150, that could be very bad for your paint job, okay? And you'll probably end up having to repaint that. So in the long run, it is not worth buying cheap sandpaper, and that is my reason. Anyway, guys, hopefully you guys enjoyed that video. Hopefully it was informative, and don't forget to like, comment, share, or subscribe, and let me know if you guys have run into this issue before. Thanks, guys. Stay spraying.